Afternoon, everyone. We'll begin momentarily. All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining another JINSA webinar. I'm JINSA's Vice President for Policy, Blaise Mishtal. I'm here with a great panel to discuss what we saw happen this week at the Ankara NATO summit that President Trump attended. I think the headline coming out of the summit was President Trump's promise to lift sanctions on Turkey and hint that he'd be willing to sell them the F-35, something that I think will be even more in the news now that we're hearing reports that Turkey is preparing to sell its S-400 Russian air defense system, which had been at least one of the obstacles to the F-35 sale. That might finally be getting rid of the S-400 and selling it to a Gulf country, potentially the UAE or Qatar has also been mentioned in some reports. But also want to discuss the NATO summit itself and Turkey's role in that alliance, which hasn't always been an easy one. To do that, I'm delighted to be joined by two of the greatest Turkey experts on either side of the Atlantic. Alan Makovsky, a fellow at the Center for American Progress and a member of JINSA's Benjamin Gettler project on the Eastern Mediterranean, and JINSA scholar and director of the Central Asia Caucasus Institute, Svante Cornell. Thank you both for being with us. Ambassador Eric Edelman was also supposed to join us, but unfortunately won't be able to make it. But I know both of you have more than enough knowledge here to fill the next hour. Svante, maybe I could start with you to tell us a little bit about the history of Turkey's relations with NATO, at least over the last 15 years or so under the reign of President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan.
Well, thank you, Blaise, and it's a delight to be with you and with Alan as always. I'm sure Alan would know better this recent history, but perhaps Alan, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I think in general we can say that first of all, on the one hand, Turkey has a foreign policy that is very, should we say, independent and transactional. It doesn't really, how to say, get into or always follow a consensus or put following a consensus in NATO at the center of its concerns. On the other hand, NATO is the only formal alliance that Turkey is part of, with the possible exception of the bilateral one with Azerbaijan. And this means that when push comes to shove and when Turkey feels insecure about one thing or another, the feeling that NATO is important gets stronger. When Turkey feels more secure and doesn't feel many threats, they tend to forget perhaps a bit about the importance of NATO for Turkey. That said, I think what we've seen over the past 15 years or so is, as always, or I shouldn't say as always, because during the Cold War, the NATO commitment by Turkey was fairly strong because there was consistently the threat of the Soviet Union. But in the past 15 years, there's been an up and down with many different iterations of Turkey shifting its momentary thinking about where NATO fits in its general security. We've had situations where Turkey was drifting more into the Middle East with a more Islamist foreign policy that was in many ways not compatible with many of NATO's goals. We've obviously had times when Turkey has felt the importance of NATO whenever it's been threatened by Russia, as it was in 2015, for example. We see that Turkey was more interested in NATO. There has always also been domestic considerations, especially with the 2016 coup that was largely believed to be orchestrated by the Gulen movement, which led to many of the, on paper, most pro-NATO American-linked officers in the Turkish military being purged, with a more nationalist group of officers taking precedence for a while, which were more critical of NATO. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that the key thing for Turkey has always been not NATO as a multilateral alliance, but the bilateral military and security relationship with the United States. And as that relationship goes, Turkey's commitment to NATO goes. So right now, where we have a very strong personal relationship between Presidents Trump and Erdogan, as you alluded to, Blaise, you will see that many of the controversies that are kept under the carpet are not brought up to the forefront, even though they might be simmering under the surface. Whereas if somebody else might be president, the situation might be different. So I'll stop here for now, and I hope Alan can add something that I missed.
Yeah, Alan, feel free to chime in, but also wanted to ask you about sort of what were the optics heading into this summit of NATO convening in Ankara, and what were sort of the expectations maybe heading into the summit?
Well, I think it was, first of all, let me just say how uh, great it is to be on a panel with you, Blaise, and with Svante, um, and to address your wonderful audience. Um, Look, this summit was supposed to be very important. They were describing it as NATO 3.0, sort of the first major summit of a new era for NATO, where Europeans take more responsibility for their own defense, while the United States diminishes its role. Uh, and Turkey wants to be at the center of this. Turkey has a growing defense industrial sector. Uh, it's, I believe last year was the 11th leading exporter of military goods, and it's climbing. And Turkey wants to be one of the primary centers for European production, physically, of equipment, of arms, and strategically for security overall. And so for Turkey, hosting this summit was highly symbolic. It was also a great prestige. It was supposed to be, and I suppose in this regard was, a great prestige builder for Erdoğan. President Trump said basically the only reason he was attending was because it was Erdoğan summit. His good friend Erdoğan was hosting it, and that was the reason for his attendance. Um, and uh, and of course, just for Turkey, under any circumstances, hosting such a major event, um, such a major security event would be a prestige builder, but for such an important NATO summit, I think it's particularly so. Maybe, by the way, I thought, Svante, you gave a fantastic overview of Turkey and NATO. I just maybe wanted to add one thought. Um, you know, it has been a source of discord, as you mentioned, uh, between Turkey and its other NATO allies. It was for many years. Turkey's relationship with Russia. Uh, I think it's been a great success for Turkey that it has basically won its alliance's acceptance of the fact that it is pursuing strategic autonomy. Um, I think this process really started with the Ukraine war, when Turkey initially, the Allies were very upset that Turkey was sitting on the fence, but then Turkey was able to negotiate a grain export deal between Ukraine and Russia. At least Turkey got credit for negotiating it. The UN was also part of the negotiating team. Um, and ever since then, it seems to me a lot of the criticism of Turkey's relations with Russia has diminished on the part of the Allies. Um, and it certainly doesn't seem to be a problem at all for President Trump. And even under President Biden, um, uh, his team said, well, Turkey has an independent foreign policy, but we can cooperate on many issues. So Turkey has managed to pursue this relationship with Russia without upsetting ties with NATO, and also for all its human rights problems. The alliance is looking the other way these days.
Yeah, I have to say I was surprised that neither of you mentioned, particularly Svante beaming into us as you are from Sweden, Turkey's role in delaying for almost 2 years Sweden's accession into NATO following the war in Ukraine. And then, Alan, to your point, among the NATO members, Turkey is the only one that did not adopt sanctions against Russia following the Ukraine invasion, and
Correct.
in fact became an important source for Russian money trying to get out and Russian exports trying to get out into the world. But
And,
as you said,
and still is, presumably.
and still is. But as you said, it seems like that is now water under the bridge, or even something that is seen as maybe a strategic advantage that Ankara has these relations with Moscow.
Well,
Yes.
yeah, no, I think that's right. Turkey, of course, always maintained, as it was criticized at the beginning of the war for not applying Russia sanctions, that it's important to have somebody who can talk to both sides. And I think I mean, this is looking at it historically, but I think they sort of won their spurs in the eyes of many people when they negotiated that grain deal so long ago in 2022. And over time, first the Biden administration, and then it seems the Europeans don't raise that issue very much. And as you say, it's seen even as an advantage that Turkey can talk to all sides. So, and it's certainly seen that way by the current U.S. administration, which, after all, has its own unique relationship with Russia, which is, at a minimum, we could say, less hostile than Biden's relationship with Russia. So,
I mean, if I
Thanks,
could add to
Swansea. Yeah.
that, yeah, so I agree fully with what you're saying, Alan. I think you could add another dimension to it, which is that while Turkey did maintain its relationship with Russia and did not join the sanctions, it also won credibility and was able to counter accusations of being too close to the Russians by its very active support from military support for Ukraine as well, and in other ways, not least because by then high standard Bayraktar missiles. I suppose today the Ukrainians are mostly using stuff that they build themselves, which are apparently better than anybody else builds. But and not only that they supplied these UAVs to Ukraine, but also had them built under contract in Ukraine. I think complicated the picture that some people saw of a Turkey that was just very very close to the Russians. And although that might not be in the newspapers, or there's also the fact that while Turkey, it's a very strange relationship, the one between Turkey and Russia, because while on the one hand, I can, in a way, similar to the way in which Erdogan can talk to Trump, he can also talk to Putin. But Turkey maintains this transactional, I guess, relationship with Russia, while also in several different theaters, basically fighting Russia's proxies in outright wars. I mean, this happened in Syria, this happened in Libya, and of course, most famously, this happened in the South Caucasus, where Turkey backed Azerbaijan's, effort to retake its territories that were for 30 years occupied by Armenian forces with Russian support. And all of these things Turkey has been able to do, taking out Russian proxies, Russia just says, okay, let's move on. Let's not talk about it. And, if you look at what happened in the South Caucasus in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and actually in 2023, Turkey's ally Azerbaijan actually mistakenly killed several Russian peacekeepers in that operation. And they just issued an apology, and the Russians, didn't even do anything. They just moved on. So it's I think what this speaks to is how much Turkey means to Russia, and how important maintaining this, economic lifeline through Turkey means to the Russians. So it's really a very complex story.
And if I could just add on that, I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, not at all.
And of course, the economic dependency goes both ways, because Russia is the number one supplier of both gas and oil to Turkey. It's long been dependent on Russian gas. They've tried to wean themselves off, but they still, import about 40% of their gas, 35 to 40% of their gas from Russia, and a significant part of their oil. And of course, Russia is building Turkey's first nuclear reactor on the Mediterranean. It's been delayed many times, but the first reactor is supposed to be completed later this year. And Russia will own and operate that reactor and sell the electricity to Turkey. That's the arrangement. So, I mean, Turkey remains very reliant on Russia, dependent on Russia. And it's, as you say, been interesting. They've been able to outmaneuver Russia yet in several arenas that you noted: Syria, Libya, the South Caucasus. Anyway, I just wanted to say on the, if I could, to bring it up to back to the summit, on this idea that Turkey is exceptional and can get away with things that other allies can't. I thought it was very striking that President Trump excoriated all the allies for not supporting our war effort against Iran, which he praised Erdoğan for not joining the Iranian side. It was, really, it gave it credit and said it's more loyal than most other countries. It's obviously a different standard applies to Turkey, at least from President Trump's point of view, than applies to other allies. Actually, I would just add on that, Turkey was actually the worst ally in terms of the Iran war. Turkey labeled it contrary to international law, closed its airspace to U.S. aircraft, refused to let the U.S. use bases in Turkey. Arguably, Spain was just as bad. I think Turkey was a little louder about it even than Spain. But yeah, I mean, rather than the best ally, it was the worst ally. But somehow Trump thought by not joining the Iranian side of the war that Turkey had done just great.
Yeah, and unlike Spain, Turkey had to rely on NATO protections against Iranian missiles that entered its airspace, and had sent a delegation just the day before the NATO summit to attend the funeral of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in Iran, which other U.S. regional partners like the Emirates refused to do. So. Yeah, certainly set a low bar there. So against that backdrop, Alan, and since you mentioned how Turkey seems to keep being viewed as exceptional, can you maybe fill us in on some of the developments during the summit in the U.S.-Turkish relationship?
Well, I think the big thing, as you mentioned at the top of the program, was that President Trump said that he plans to get rid of sanctions against Turkey. And he said that he would strongly consider selling the F-35s to Turkey. And I think those are really the two big and related developments that came out of the summit in U.S.-Turkish relations.
Yeah, can you maybe sort of walk us through the significance of those? What are the sanctions he was referring to, and how does that relate to the F-35?
So the sanctions he's referring to primarily are the CAATSA sanctions, which were imposed. CAATSA, countering America's adversary through sanctions.
Through sanctions.
It's an act, yeah. Often just referred to as CAATSA, were imposed by Congress to prevent significant transactions with Russia, in effect, with Russia's intelligence and defense agencies. And when Turkey bought the S-400s, bought S-400 air defense equipment, it was expelled from the F-35 program, and sanctions were put on its major arms purchasing agency, government agency. That has complicated arms sales to Turkey, although we managed to find a way around that when we agreed to sell F-16s to Turkey as a way to persuade Turkey to approve Sweden's entry into NATO, as you alluded to earlier. The big sanction on Turkey really was a law passed by Congress in December 2019 as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, which said very explicitly that Turkey cannot purchase the F-35s unless it gives up possession of this S-400 air defense equipment that it had bought from Russia. Since that time, that has probably been the number one issue in U.S.-Turkish relations from Turkey's point of view. Erdoğan badly wants the F-35. Its regional rival Greece has contracted to buy F-35s, which will start arriving, I believe, in 2028. Israel has had F-35s for nearly a decade. Israel was the first country other than the United States to get F-35s. Number one on Turkey's shopping list, they'd like to get out of that restriction and buy F-35s. So, yeah, now I don't think Trump can lift sanctions unilaterally. These are congressionally imposed. But the major issue, even if you got rid of CAATSA entirely, the law about restricting F-35 purchases would still be operative. So that's really the big issue, I think. By the way, I would just quickly add, he said, you don't sanction friends. But it so happens in his first term, he sanctioned Turkey on 3 different occasions. So he seems not to remember that. He's changed a few narratives about his relations with Turkey in his first term.
Yeah, so a couple points. First of all, to fully understand the F-35 issue, I'd commend the report that Alan and Svante and Ambassador Edelman did last year on the issue called Flight Risk, which you can find on our website. But also just yesterday, my colleague Jonah Brody published an analysis of what the various legal barriers to selling the F-35 are and what President Trump can and cannot do unilaterally. But I guess in that context, Alan, as you pointed out, it's that NDAA provision about Turkey possessing the S-400. That's the real barrier here. In light of that, what's the significance of the news that we're hearing this morning that maybe Turkey is actually going to finally sell this thing?
You're asking me?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Well, of course, it's highly significant. Turkey will have then met the standard of this legislation for eligibility for the F-35. It will no longer possess the S-400, if this report is true. It was a report that came from a Turkish journalist very close to the Turkish government. Does that mean automatically it will get the F-35s? Actually, in my opinion, yes, it probably does mean that. However, there will be considerable resistance in Congress, and many congressmen have already made clear that they oppose Turkey's getting the F-35 for reasons of Turkey not being a good ally, because of its relations with Russia, because of its support for Hamas, because of its growing hostility to Israel, because of its occupation of the northern third of Cyprus, and because of its longstanding rivalry with Greece. So there are a lot of foreign policy arguments that opponents of the F-35 sale make. That said, it's very difficult to stop an arms sale that an administration wants to make if there are no legal barriers like, the 2019 law. The only way you can stop an arms sale, really, there are various hurdles. Traditionally, if top congressmen object, traditionally, the administration won't put the sale forward, but the Trump administration is not expected to bow to those traditions. Congress's only means of stopping an arms sale is through a resolution, a joint resolution of disapproval, which it has to do within 15 days, which is very difficult to do for Congress to do anything within 15 days. And even if it were to do such a thing, which has only happened once in history, as far as I know, when Congress did pass a joint resolution of disapproval for a Saudi arms sale, that was, I believe, in 2019. It's just regular legislation. That means the president can veto it, which is what happened in the Saudi case. And then Congress needs a 2/3 majority of both houses to override the veto. So I think it's very unlikely when you have a Republican majority in the House and in the Senate, even though some of them do oppose the F-35 sale on strategic ground, very unlikely you're going to get a 2/3 majority opposing it. So I think if Turkey really is getting rid of the S-400, yeah, that's probably a good bet that they're going to actually get it.
So, Svante, curious about whether you're surprised to hear that Turkey might finally, after 6 years and all sorts of entreaties from the United States and threats, finally be ready to get rid of the S-400? And if so, why now? Why do you think Erdoğan is displaying some flexibility now?
So that's a good question. I'm, if anything, surprised that they didn't find a way to get rid of the S-400s before, because we should remind our audience that these S-400s have remained in boxes in a warehouse somewhere, who knows where. I mean, Alan probably knows where it is. So they haven't been used. They haven't even been unwrapped, if you will. So the question is, if you have them in a hangar somewhere, why do you keep them? If this is what's holding up, as Alan so clearly described, the purchase of the F-35s. So several reasons. One is probably the most important, is probably what it would do to the relationship with Russia. And that having purchased these, Russia has, whether formally or informally, a say in where they go and what is done, and whether it's a losing face for the Russians, and whether it would somehow affect the Turkish-Russian relationship, or perhaps even more importantly, the Putin-Erdogan personal relationship, if Turkey were to get rid of them. So why now? I mean, you're seeing all over the neighborhood of Russia how the former empire is cracking in the seams, and how states that 5 years ago would have not dared to challenge Russian interests in one way or another are now doing so. You see it in Central Asia, for example. You see it, what happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan would never have happened if Russia had been a stronger power, for example. And the elephant in the room, of course, is how badly this war against Ukraine is going for Russia. How this war is, as we see now, is directly affecting Russian cities, Russian, energy security, and the availability of gasoline and so on. So the Russians are the threshold, so to speak, for doing something that Mr. Putin might not like is not what it used to be 10 years ago, or even several years ago. I think Turkey feels that it can, the upside, especially with President Trump in power and a more stable U.S. relationship, where they feel that, and I think you just alluded to this, Alan, was it, if I remember correctly, or was it you, Blaze, that President Trump said, or Erdogan said, that President Trump always keeps his promises. This type of rhetoric suggests that there's a personal trust between the leaders, because for Turkey, the worst situation would be you get rid of the S-400s, Wherever they go, there are discussions to send them to Azerbaijan or not to a Gulf state. And suddenly, then the U.S. wouldn't deliver. That would be a nightmare scenario because then you end up with egg on your face, and you've undermined your relationship with the Russians, and you become kind of a laughingstock. So I think the Turks are very heavily counting on this being realized. Otherwise, they wouldn't be getting rid of the S-400s.
Hmm. So you're saying that if Erdogan gets the F-35, he'll have Zelensky to thank for it?
Yes.
Hmm. Um, Alan, is sort of the list of sanctions or legal obstacles to the sale of the F-35 to Turkey sort of the only considerations that should be going into the sale for the United States?
That should be. Yeah. Well, I mentioned to you
Yeah.
that there are many voices in Congress, although not clear that it would be a majority, that are objecting on strategic grounds because of the various issues I've raised. Look, I think there's plenty of reason to be concerned. I share some of the concerns of those congressmen because of the aggressive role Turkey has played in the region and because of its aggressive rhetoric has threatened that it might play a more difficult role. Particularly some of its rhetoric towards Israel. So the foreign minister recently saying that Israel has become a burden that humanity can no longer bear. Erdogan describing Zionism as a genocidal, occupying ideology. The Turkish interior minister saying that he looks forward to Turkey's return to running Jerusalem, and he hopes to be the governor of Jerusalem. These are not remarks. People generally, you might say, okay, it's all politics, but these are very disturbing remarks. And I think Turkey's attitudes towards Turkey's attitudes towards Israel need to be clarified before any F-35 sale is completed. I think that's really the most disturbing new issue on the horizon. And of course, Greece has reason to be concerned too. And Turkey's attitude about the Aegean, where Turkey makes vast claims, something called the blue homeland. Now, Greece also makes claims that Turkey doesn't like. And so, but I think it has to be clear that Turkey does not intend to use force on any of these issues. And actually, that Turkey will not interfere with ongoing projects that Greece and Cyprus have in their territorial waters and their EEZs. So, yeah, I think it's questionable whether we can sell it. Now, at a time when we're saying that, Europe has to get stronger, Turkey is a NATO member, I think it's going to be hard to deny Turkey those F-35s. But do I personally have reservations? Yes, I do.
So, Svanti, given, as you were just laying out, some of Turkey's newfound flexibility on the S-400, do you think that also will apply to some of these other friction areas that Alan laid out? Do you think that this is maybe a new direction for Erdogan, a new, more cooperative, less aggressive Erdogan, or what should we expect from him if and when he gets the F-35?
Well, the general sense in recently has been that Turkey is leaning back towards NATO and the U.S. Because the bilateral relationship with the U.S. is better than it has been. I fully agree with everything Alan said. The question with Turkey and especially with Erdogan and his government is always to what extent Turkish policy and Turkish rhetoric are the same thing. A lot of people that I speak to in Turkey think that a lot of the rhetoric, whether it be on Greece or the Aegean or whether especially on Israel, is just that. It's just theater, it's just feeding the base. Now, whether it's rhetoric or not, it's still profoundly harmful because it has turned, it has helped to turn the tide in terms of the Turkish society and the outlook in Turkish society on issues like this, because at the end of the day, the fish rots from the head, so to speak. Number one, and obviously the situation today is extremely far from what we had, a few decades ago when Turkey and Israel were allied countries for all practical purposes. So that's the question. I think even if you're just feeding the base with rhetoric, sometimes your base becomes a Frankenstein, so to speak. So I'm not at all trying to minimize the dangers or the not just the dangers, but also the nature of the rhetoric that President Erdoğan and his close advisors are using. But very frequently we've seen that Turkish actions and Turkish rhetoric are very far from each other, whereas the rhetoric has been a lot stronger and the actions have basically not been there. Since there was many years ago, the Turkey threatened one of the oil exploration or gas exploration vessels that were in the Aegean, or in the Eastern Mediterranean, rather. To what extent that is today preventing the development of these resources, I'm not sure. So it's a difficult determination to make. Turkey seems to find its relationship with the West more important than it did. That also has to do with the fact that the criticism, or Western countries interfering with Erdogan's power or aspirations to maintain power and consolidate control are not there. I think that's probably the main reason Turkey has today a positive relationship with both European countries and with the United States. Whereas in the past, there were a lot of actions taken, even though they were not very serious, but there was a constant irritant for Erdogan that Turkey was exposed to Western pressure on human rights and on democracy. Now we see the closure essentially of the main opposition party, and nobody's even mentioning it. So I think that with Erdogan, at the end of the day, whatever the rhetoric, yes, he is originally deeply ideological person. I don't think there's a question about that, and I've written about that myself. But I think the older he's gotten, the more the control, the power, and the control over assets and power has become more central. And as long as that's not challenged, I think he can be a transactional partner in many ways.
Yeah, to that last point, Alan, the NATO Charter describes itself as an organization that's dedicated to democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. Was there any mention of human rights and all of the recent Turkish attempts to shut down opposition that Svante alluded to during the Ankara summit?
If so, went right by me. I missed it. Not to my knowledge, no mention. Look, I think it's unlikely that Turkey, if it were not in NATO and applying for NATO membership today, and if NATO were taking that part of the charter that you quoted seriously, Turkey, there's no way Turkey could join NATO. But for now, human rights has simply fallen off the table in favor of strategic issues broadly, but also Europe is concerned about refugees. And since 2016, it's basically had an arrangement with Turkey where Turkey would not allow its huge refugee population to flow westward towards Europe. And that supersedes concerns about human rights. So you could chart it. Since 2016, Europe talks less about human rights. And of course, for the Biden administration, it's not an issue. I mean, human rights is just simply isn't on the table. The Biden administration said human rights was going to be at the center of its foreign policy, but that in fact did not happen. And to be fair to Trump, I mean, the Biden administration also did not put much emphasis on human rights. So we're not hearing the types of criticisms we heard about Turkey, let's say, a decade and more ago regarding human rights. And we sure didn't hear it at the NATO summit, and we're not likely to hear it very much in the near future. You do hear the European Parliament will pass a resolution now and then. There are some issues that come up in the Council of Europe, which is a separate organization. But these are like little squeaks compared with the chorus of criticism that used to descend on Turkey in that regard. No.
Could I add to this?
Sure. Let me just say quickly, Svante, that I do want to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you do have anything you want to ask our panelists, please feel free to submit it using the Q&A function in Zoom, and I'll read it out. But then, yeah, Svante, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to mention there is an issue we haven't discussed in terms of NATO's role in NATO. I'm sorry, Turkey's role in NATO, which has to do with the change in the relationship between the United States and Europe. With the statements that President Trump has made repeatedly about NATO, putting in question America's commitment to the defense of Europe and even to our NATO Article 5. And the most absolutely central part of this, of course, was the controversy over Greenland. All of these things has meant that for European powers, looking at, even if it's a low risk, for the first time, people are talking about what would happen if the US was not, committed to its role in NATO. And then you have a reality for the European Union that perhaps the two most central powers in Europe are not EU countries. It's the United Kingdom and Turkey in terms of military power. You could add France to that list perhaps, and increasingly, of course, Poland in the future, but that's not quite there. So, we keep talking about Turkey as the second largest land force in NATO, and that means, if the Europeans have begun to question America's commitment to Europe, I think it's a no-brainer that for the security and strategic reasons Alan alluded to, you are going to swallow your pride and not mention these human rights issues, because now it's about the security of Europe itself. I mean, we should remember that many of the high defense officials and military officials in Europe, you have these quotes every week or so about when or why, if Russia is going to be in a position or have a willingness to threaten Article 5 in NATO by some kind of, plausible deniability operation in a Baltic state or against Poland. So I think we absolutely have to see the status of Turkey for the European members of NATO completely against this background.
I guess let me ask you on that, Svante and Alan, two things. One is, what was it in 2013, 2014 during the Syrian war, a Turkish jet got shot down by Russian air defenses during the 2015, and Turkey at least made some noises about wanting NATO to invoke Article 5 and collective self-defense, and basically everyone said nothing or laughed them out of the room or turned their backs. So given Turkey's relationship with Moscow that we discussed earlier, is the mood, Svante, in Stockholm really that they expect Turkish troops are going to come to Sweden's defense if Russian forces come across the border?
No, but beggars can't be choosers. And the level of panic that has seeped through Europe in the last year or two as a result of the perceived threat from Russia, and as a result of the feeling that you can't trust the United States anymore. And this sense of panic is all the more acute in the two countries that are the most recent to join NATO. Sweden and Finland joined, feeling like, okay, we're finally secure. And then suddenly, this anchor of NATO that you thought was going to protect you might not do that anymore. And in that situation, you see all kinds of bilateral deals being made with the British, with the French. I wouldn't be surprised at all if these type of bilateral deals are made with Turkey. Countries in Northern Europe are talking about, deals with France to take part of the French nuclear umbrella. I mean, this is what's happening in Europe these days. So to the extent that you can bring the second largest military force in Turkey closer to you, you tip the balances, you increase the deterrence, the deterrence against the Russians to do something that would harm their relationship, not just with NATO, but with Turkey, which which is so important to them.
Mm. Could I just add? I mean,
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
I completely agree with Svante, and I think that was one of the reasons Turkey wanted to have this summit, saying it's symbolic to have it in Turkey, because Turkey wants to be integrated into European defense, into the new European defense structure, to be at the center of it. But we do have to remember that most NATO states are also members of the European Union. And as one Turkish diplomat said to me once, that Turkey's, at times, these seem like two different organizations, two different mindsets, even though it's largely the same countries. And any sort of formal integration of Turkey, at least into the EU effort, is going to require approval from Greece and Cyprus. And so far, Turkey is being kept out of the program. I'm forgetting what the acronym SAFE stands for. You may remember. But that is the program to plan for European defense integration. Turkey is having some success doing bilateral co-production deals with Italy and with Spain, but I think it makes sense strategically for Turkey to be integrated and to be an important center for producing security for Europe, but it's by no means a done deal.
Sure.
I wanted to go back to the Israel discussion for a second, if I could.
Sure.
If that's okay. I just wanted to say, I'm not saying that Turkey is about to attack Israel. I agree, most of this is rhetoric. But and I think Turkey has no real interest in attacking Israel. But as the rhetoric gets heated up, one doesn't know. Long time pointed out, well, despite the rhetoric, Turkey and Israel have great economic relations. But ultimately, pressure on Erdoğan from his right wing led him to boycott, to end that trade and to boycott Israel. And you just never know, particularly with Turkish military and Israeli militaries cheek by jowl, more or less, in Syria and now in Somalia. You just never know where this heated rhetoric could end. And I certainly hope the U.S. behind the scenes is working hard to make sure that the rhetoric stays only at the rhetoric level. But sometimes these things get out of control. So if we're going to sell them F-35s, I think there have to be some kind of explicit understanding. So that's all I was trying to say.
Yeah, maybe related to that, Alan, maybe we could end with this question. There's an interview with Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan recently in which he was asked about whether Turkey was interested in nuclear weapons or pursuing nuclear weapons. And he just sort of smiled and evaded the question. And actually, I was in Israel recently, and officials there told us that it's their understanding that Fidan had actually specifically asked for that question to be asked to him. So what are we to make of his non-answer, and should there be any concern about Turkey's interest or pursuit of nuclear weapons, given, as you said, the Russian-built reactor that's already there?
Well, I think we don't want to see the nuclear club grow at all. And Turkey is under the U.S. umbrella. But I do think there is Turkish interest in it. They see Iran possibly moving towards nuclear status and or arguably already a nuclear threshold state. And Israel, of course, has nuclear arms, although it doesn't acknowledge it. It's an open secret. It's not surprising that states like Turkey and Saudi Arabia would also be interested in acquiring nuclear arms. And this sort of budding quartet that Turkey has been talking about with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, I think in the back of Turkey's mind probably has a nuclear dimension because Pakistan is a nuclear state.
Svanti, last word goes to you.
Well, I mean, I think for the last several years, actually for fairly long now, we've been living in a world where security, collective security is increasingly unreliable. If the Europeans are no longer trusting the or worried about the American security umbrella, why should Turkey trust the US nuclear security umbrella? So I think the risk that one other state in this region works towards getting nuclear weapons is fairly strong. Whether it's the Saudis or the Turks who move first, we'll have to see, but I'm sure that if one moves, the other will too. And at the end of the day, it all depends on what happens with Iran, because we have to remember that for the past 50 years or more, almost 50 years, I should say, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been the prime mover for all kinds of security issues in this region and has been the one that everybody else has reacted to. This is true for the Gulf states, this is true for Israel, this is true for Turkey. Now, Iran may be reduced to size, which will reduce the feeling among other states that they may have to acquire nuclear weapons, but that depends on how this war ends and what Iran looks like in a year or two.
And whether or not it has F-35s, perhaps. So, Svanti, Alan, thank you very much for your time and your analysis today. Thank you to the audience who tuned in. If you want more Turkey analysis, please check out our Benjamin Gettler Center for East Med Security at our website, jinsa.org, where, if I say so myself, some of the best Turkey analysis to be found in DC is available. And very much look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.